High in the Himalayas, Tibet is often imagined through the lens of Tibetan Buddhism, monasteries, prayer flags, monks, mandalas, and the Dalai Lama. But beneath that familiar image is another tradition, older in memory and deeply intertwined with Tibet's religious identity. It is called Bon, or Yungdrung Bon, often translated as Eternal Bon. For its followers, known as Bonpos, Bon is not a minor footnote to Tibetan Buddhism. It is a complete sacred tradition with its own founder, scriptures, rituals, cosmology, monastic institutions, and spiritual path. Yet Bon is also difficult to explain in simple terms, because it resembles Tibetan Buddhism in many ways while also preserving elements that point toward earlier Tibetan religious worlds. That tension is what makes Bon fascinating. Is it Tibet's pre-Buddhist religion? A form of Tibetan Buddhism? A rival tradition? Or a living synthesis shaped by centuries of exchange? The word Bon has been used in several different ways, and that is one reason the topic can become confusing. In the broadest sense, Bon refers to the indigenous Tibetan religious tradition practiced by Bonpos. In a more specific sense, Yungdrung Bon refers to the classical organized form of the religion that emerged most clearly around the 10th and 11th centuries. Some scholars also use the term ancient Bon for earlier ritual traditions associated with Tibet before the rise of Buddhism, while new Bon refers to later movements that absorbed and blended influences from both Bon and Buddhism. So when someone says Bon is ancient, they may mean its mythic and ritual roots reach into pre-Buddhist Tibet. But when scholars speak about Bon as a fully self-conscious organized religion, they often point to a later historical period, after Buddhism had already transformed Tibetan culture. Bonpos themselves trace their religion to a sacred geography centered not only in Tibet, but in the ancient kingdom of Zhangzhung. This kingdom is traditionally associated with the region around Mount Kailash, one of the most revered mountains in Asia. In Bonpo accounts, Bon was first taught in Zhangzhung and then transmitted into Tibet. Mount Kailash, already sacred to several religious traditions, becomes in this story more than a dramatic landscape. It is a spiritual axis, a place where myth, history, and identity meet. The Bonpo origin narrative gives Bon a lineage independent from Indian Buddhism. Instead of beginning with the historical Buddha Shakyamuni in India, Bon looks to its own sacred past, its own teachers, and its own transmission. That distinction matters, because it allows Bonpos to understand themselves not as imitators of Buddhism, but as heirs to an equally profound path. At the center of Bonpo tradition stands Shenrab Maiwo, revered as the founder and great teacher of Bon. In Bonpo belief, Shenrab Maiwo plays a role comparable in importance to the Buddha in Buddhism. He is the enlightened source who revealed the teachings, established the path, and brought sacred knowledge into the human world. Historically, however, scholars have not been able to verify Shenrab Maiwo as a figure in the same way they discuss some historical religious founders. This does not make him unimportant. In religious traditions, founding figures often operate on more than one level. They are historical claims, but also symbols of authority, continuity, and sacred origin. For Bonpos, Shenrab Maiwo anchors the tradition in a meaningful story of revelation. For scholars, he shows how Bon developed a full religious identity with its own sacred biography and lineage. The relationship between Bon and Tibetan Buddhism is one of the most debated questions in Tibetan studies. On the surface, the similarities are striking. Bon has monasteries, monks, philosophical teachings, ritual cycles, meditation practices, funerary rites, protective deities, and elaborate cosmology. Many of these features resemble Tibetan Buddhism, especially the Nyingma school, the oldest of the major Tibetan Buddhist traditions. This resemblance has led some scholars, such as Geoffrey Samuel, to describe Bon as essentially a variant of Tibetan Buddhism, while still acknowledging that it preserves genuinely old non-Buddhist elements. David Snellgrove also regarded Bon as a kind of heterodox Buddhism. That word heterodox does not simply mean false. It means outside the accepted orthodox form. In other words, Bon may share a Buddhist-shaped religious world while maintaining a separate identity and origin story. Another scholarly view emphasizes historical development. John Powers, for example, argues that the evidence suggests Bon became a self-conscious religious system under the influence of Buddhism. This does not mean Bon was invented out of nothing. Rather, it suggests that older Tibetan rituals, myths, and practices may have been reorganized into a more formal tradition after Buddhism became powerful in Tibet. This pattern is not unusual in religious history. Traditions often define themselves in response to rivals, neighbors, reform movements, and political change. When Buddhism spread through Tibet, it introduced new models of scripture, monastic organization, philosophy, and religious authority. Bon may have adopted some of these structures while preserving and reinterpreting earlier Tibetan material. The result was not simply Buddhism under another name, but a distinct tradition shaped by both inheritance and adaptation. To understand Bon, it helps to avoid the idea that religions exist in sealed containers. Tibet was never a place where one tradition remained pure and untouched while another arrived fully formed. Religious life was layered. Local spirits, mountain cults, royal rituals, funerary practices, Indian Buddhist philosophy, tantric methods, and regional Himalayan traditions all interacted. Bon and Tibetan Buddhism influenced each other over centuries. Sometimes they competed. Sometimes they borrowed. Sometimes they shared terminology and ritual forms while explaining them through different lineages. This makes Bon hard to classify, but also historically rich. It challenges the modern desire to place every religion into a clean category: ancient, Buddhist, shamanic, indigenous, or syncretic. Bon can contain pieces of all those descriptions, depending on which period, text, ritual, or community is being discussed. For much of Tibetan Buddhist history, Bon was often described negatively by Buddhist writers. Some Buddhist histories portrayed Bon as a rival, an inferior path, or a source of opposition to Buddhism's arrival in Tibet. These accounts were not neutral academic descriptions. They were part of religious competition, identity formation, and sometimes political storytelling. When a tradition wants to present itself as the true path, it may cast older or rival traditions as obstacles that had to be overcome. Bonpos, in turn, preserved their own accounts of origin, transmission, and legitimacy. The tension between these narratives shaped how Bon was remembered. For a long time, many outsiders learned about Bon mainly through Buddhist sources that were hostile toward it. That created a distorted picture, reducing Bon to superstition or anti-Buddhist resistance instead of seeing it as a complex living tradition. A major change came with the Rime movement, an ecumenical movement within Tibetan Buddhism that encouraged greater openness toward different schools and lineages. Rime thinkers sought to preserve diverse teachings rather than forcing all traditions into one dominant framework. This helped create a more respectful atmosphere for studying and engaging with Bon. Although Rime was a Buddhist movement, its broader spirit of non-sectarian appreciation mattered for Bonpo-Buddhist relations. It showed that Tibetan religious life could be understood as a shared landscape rather than a battlefield of mutually exclusive claims. In practice, Bonpos and Buddhists often lived near each other, participated in overlapping cultural worlds, and shared many concerns: liberation, ritual protection, ethical life, death, rebirth, and the taming of suffering. The boundaries remained real, but they were not always absolute. Western academic interest in Bon grew significantly in the 20th century, especially from the 1960s onward. One important figure was the English scholar David Snellgrove, whose work helped encourage serious study of Bon as a tradition worthy of attention in its own right. This was a turning point. Instead of treating Bon only as a background to Tibetan Buddhism, scholars began examining Bonpo texts, rituals, histories, and communities directly. The Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1950 also changed the global situation. As Tibetan religious teachers, scholars, and refugees moved into exile, Bonpo knowledge traveled with them. Bonpo scholars and lamas began reaching Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. Their presence allowed researchers and practitioners to encounter Bon through living representatives, not only through polemical histories or scattered manuscripts. Today, Bon remains a minority religion among Tibetans, but it is not merely a relic. It continues in Tibet, especially in eastern regions, and among Tibetan communities in exile. Bonpos centers now exist in cities around the world, where teachings, rituals, and meditation practices are transmitted to both Tibetans and non-Tibetans. This modern global presence raises another important point: Bon is not frozen in the ancient past. Like every living tradition, it adapts to new languages, institutions, audiences, and political realities. For Tibetan Bonpos, preserving Bon can be an act of religious devotion and cultural survival. For global students, Bon can offer a window into a less familiar side of Tibetan spirituality. But serious engagement requires care. Bon should not be romanticized as a pure pre-Buddhist fossil, nor dismissed as a copy of Buddhism. The story of Bon ultimately complicates the way we think about religious origins. It asks us to hold several truths at once. Bon has deep roots in Tibetan cultural memory and claims an origin in Zhangzhung around Mount Kailash. It reveres Shenrab Maiwo as its founder and maintains a distinct Bonpo identity. At the same time, the organized tradition known as Yungdrung Bon developed in close conversation with Tibetan Buddhism, borrowing, adapting, resisting, and preserving. Its history includes rivalry, misunderstanding, scholarship, exile, survival, and renewal. That is why Bon matters. It reveals Tibet not as a single religious story, but as a layered civilization where traditions shaped each other across centuries. To understand Bon is not to solve a simple puzzle. It is to see how living religions remember the past, defend their identity, and continue to evolve. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.